Niebuhr begins by talking about the human condition, and this is the human condition after the fall. And he says that on the one hand, humans are finite creatures. I'm sure you know this. We are fundamentally distinguished from our Creator, who is sufficient in and of himself, because we are dependent upon God and upon others. God is independent, radically so. We are dependent. We are born helpless, unable to look after ourselves, and we die in much the same way. We are limited by our energy. We need to sustain ourselves with food and with rest, and we are mortal. You will die. According to Isaiah, compared to God, our lives are as nothing. He says this in chapter 40. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. We're finite. That's part of our human condition, but it's only one part. On the other hand, we are free. Take a look at Psalm 8. Psalm 8 gloriously affirms the nature of humanity. There we read, "Yet you have made them a little lower than heavenly beings and crowned them with glory and honor." God has made us in his image, and we are free. God has given us the power of transcendence, not as a divine attribute, but through imagining new possibilities and engaging in transformative work, we have the power to transcend the here and the now. As Pascal says, man is a reed, the weakest in nature, but he is a thinking reed. We truly are exalted and lowly. We are the angel beast. And this condition, this finitude on the one hand, this finiteness, and this freedom on the other, together results in anxiety in our lives. Anxiety, Niebuhr writes, is the inevitable spiritual state of humanity, standing in the paradoxical situation of freedom and finiteness. Anxiety is the internal description of the state of temptation. You know a lot about this. You know, we are anxious about everything. Everything. We are anxious about our reputations. We are anxious about our effectiveness. We are anxious about the size of our churches. We are anxious about the reach of our influence. We're anxious about what happened yesterday, and if we did something wrong. We're anxious about what's happening today, and can I meet everything I need to do? And we're anxious about what's coming tomorrow, right? We live in a culture that values success, and we constantly assess and evaluate, right? I just ask my students. We assess them nonstop, right? I mean, we're constantly asking, are you okay? Are you feeling okay? Can anything be better, right? How are you doing? All these things, and we create this sense of we're judging all the time, and we're being judged all the time. And certainly social media plays a role in this. And so we're stuck. We know, do I measure up? Are my students happy? Are your parishioners happy? What do others think of me? Am I reaching my goals? More and more of my students are coming to college fundamentally and even clinically anxious. Anxiety, in turn, breeds fear. We are anxious about everything that we cannot control, and this makes us fundamentally afraid of what will happen. And it is this anxiety and fear more than anything else that exhausts us. This exhaustion, this deep exhaustion we feel. And this is, I think, what my friend was actually talking about, right? And we see it displayed in our political culture today. Well, anxiety is the precondition of sin. It's not sin itself. Anxiety is the precondition of sin. It quickly becomes sin depending upon our response. And Niebuhr points out that we typically respond in one of two ways. Either we deny our finite nature and fully embrace our freedom, or on the other hand, we deny our freedom and embrace our finitude. So I want to explore these just a little bit. Denying our freedom and embracing our finitude results in what Niebuhr calls the sin of sensuality. Here we embrace our creatureliness, our animal nature, and we give unlimited devotion to limited values. This perspective privileges the human pursuit of pleasure above all else, and at the end of the line, and there's many, many steps in this line, it frequently produces addiction, whether it be to money, to possessions, to sex, to alcohol, to drugs, or even something else, we abandon our freedom, which is part of our human nature, and we forget about our true selves. That's one side of this larger analysis of sin. But on the other hand, we can also deny that we are finite, that we are limited. And we can embrace our freedom such that we exhibit the sin of pride. And this manifests as the desire to control our situation, the people around us, as much as we can, right? We become control freaks. And this is the pride of power. This is the false exertion of our power. We desire to control the finite nature of our lives so that others behave the way we want, and so that nothing can fundamentally hurt us. And that's what drives us usually. It's our fear of being hurt, right? We believe that if we are in control, then everything will work out okay. Fundamentally, however, this quest for power denies our limited and dependent human condition. Now, a small caveat, please recognize that as I'm speaking today, I'm speaking from the perspective of power. And in a large part, I believe I'm speaking to the powerful. Right? So this is the message I think that we need to hear. But there's a very different message that I could give that would be the message from the margins, from the perspective of powerlessness, and it would be very different than what I'm suggesting here today. And I think that what sin looks like from that perspective is different in some ways as well. But here I think that speaking from the margins requires that you speak from experience. And so today, being honest, I'm speaking from the perspective of power. I'm a white male, I have my PhD, I teach at college, I'm speaking from the perspective of power. So once we have this analysis, this idea of our human condition, that when we deny who we are, our human condition that creates anxiety in and of itself, we deny who we are and we come into the sin of sensuality or the sin of pride, and especially the pride of power, we turn to Jesus now, and we begin to see that Jesus shows us something so fundamentally different from this. He shows us a different way. The power of the cross is a fundamentally different power than the one that we have been describing. And that isn't to say that Jesus is unfamiliar with the power of control. In the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus turns his face toward Jerusalem, he tells his disciples 3 separate times that he is going to Jerusalem to suffer and to die. And strangely, it seems that when the disciples hear him describe this, they hear that he's going to Jerusalem to conquer and control. Now, how do we know this? We know this by their responses to what he's saying. The first time he says he's going to do this, you know this, Peter stands up and says, "No, Jesus, it can't be." And Jesus actually calls him Satan, right? And then what does he do? What is his teaching in that moment? He then says to them, after rebuking Peter, that they have to be ready to take up the cross themselves in order to follow him. And you know these words from Mark 8, "For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." That's the first time he predicts his death. And then the second time he predicts his death, the disciples get into a debate about who is the greatest among them. They're concerned about power. And in response, Jesus places a child in their midst and teaches them that the secret of what is to come is found in the child. And the third time then he predicts his death, and what happens? You know this. James and John come to him and ask, "When you enter your glory, can I be on your right and he be on your left? Can we be in power? Can we have control?" And the disciples hear this, and they all start to grumble at their presumption, probably saying, "Man, I wish I thought of asking that first," right? And what does Jesus do? This is one of the most profound statements. I mean, the gospel, of course, is full of profound statements, but this one I love. Jesus says, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them." And that's exactly the power we've been describing, right? And Jesus responds, "It is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." Jesus does not only undermine our understanding of power in his teaching, he shows us a new form of power at the cross. At the cross, Jesus suffers the abuse of the powerful, and in so doing, exposes the deceitful foundation of their power, built on this desire to control out of fear. We must remember that the cross only receives its glory because of Jesus. In the Roman Empire, the cross was a tool of power and control to execute criminals and rebels. In other words, to keep the population in check. The fact that Jesus dies on a cross is a scandal. It's a scandal then, and it's a scandal now. It reveals his weakness in the face of the power of those who wish to do him harm. And yet, the New Testament authors are convinced this is not weakness. The cross is the means by which God is both defeating the principalities and powers of this world, and the cross is the means by which God works the redemption of humanity. The cross, the suffering and humiliating cross, is a victory. Through dying, the one who cannot die defeats the power of death. Listen to the words of Hebrews 2, verses 14 and 15. Since, therefore, the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. That is the power of the cross, conquering the fear that drives our lives. Familiar with the words of that spiritual? Right? Ride on, King Jesus. No one shall hinder thee. Through the cross, Jesus exposes the unjust powers that seek to control through violence. And in their exposure, these powers face the ultimate loss of their power. It's not immediate, but it's final. Listen to the words of Colossians 2, verses 13 to 15. When you were dead in trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive together with him when he forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. He set this aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it. This is the power of the cross, to expose the false power in our midst. We are faced with a paradox, and it's one that makes us very, very uncomfortable. The path to victory goes through the cross. The power of the cross comes through suffering violence in hopes of resurrection. That is trusting the power of God. This means that we conquer through the surrender of our desire to control. Faith is our shield, our unwavering faith that God is our sure defender. I cannot guarantee my significance, but I can trust God with my significance and my reputation. These words from Stanley Hauerwas describe this, and I find this very powerful. Hauerwas says this. He says, discipleship quite simply means extended training in being dispossessed. I'll repeat that. Discipleship quite simply means extended training in being dispossessed. To become followers of Jesus means that we must, like him, be dispossessed of all that we think gives us power over our own lives and over the lives of others. This is not an apathetic giving up. This is the willing surrender of my identity and my goals to God. As I take up my cross and follow him, I gain my life as I find it in him. Our call to discipleship is the call to take up our cross and to follow Jesus. And we find the power of the cross in our surrender to God.